In 1999, golfer Payne Stewart set out on a Learjet with 5 friends on his way to Dallas. The plane took off with no problem and checked in with air traffic control shortly after reaching cruising altitude. But when the plane reached the point where it was supposed to make a turn toward Dallas, the air traffic controller couldn't reach the pilots on the plane. There was no response from them on the radio, and the plane failed to make its turn. Fighter planes were sent up to see if they could tell what was wrong, and they saw no movement in the cabin or the flight deck. The windows were frosted over on the inside, an indication that the cabin was not properly pressurized. There was ice all over the inside of the windows. The pilots of the fighter planes were helpless to do anything except watch, and the Learjet just flew straight onwards until it ran out of fuel and then crashed from the sky with the loss of all life on board. Now, an investigation took place, as it always does when there's a plane accident like this, and the cause was discovered. Maintenance had been done on a part of the cabin pressurization system, and after the part was replaced, to test that it was working properly, the cabin had to be pressurized on the ground. And in order to do that, the mechanic had to set a switch to manual and then pressurize the cabin. And he should have returned the switch to the normal automatic setting when he was done, but he failed to do that. Now, checking this setting is a normal part of every pre-flight checklist, but somehow that step was missed on this particular flight, and the plane took off without resetting that switch to the auto setting. And the cabin failed to pressurize. This is something that the occupants would not even notice. It would start off at first with no overt symptoms except maybe just a slight headache. There would be a slow deterioration of mental capacity, and then unconsciousness would follow, and by then, of course, it's too late. What on earth does this have to do with Romans chapter 1? Well, we'll get to that. We are picking up in verse 18 of Romans 1. When we left off, Paul had been saying that the gospel is the power of God. Great news. And it brings the righteousness of God. So that makes verse 18 quite a bit of a rude shock. It says the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. From good news to terrible news in one verse. Now, Paul is beginning in a very logical way. He is showing that the gospel is necessary due to our condition, our lostness, our sin. And this puts us under God's wrath. And so I'm going to read verses 18 to 20 to start with in chapter 1. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now let's begin by looking at the word wrath. Some versions use the word anger. Anger is, particularly human anger, is very often emotion-driven. It's often out of proportion to the offense. People can kill people over someone taking $10 from them or something like that. It's often unjust, it's often vengeful. God's wrath, on the other hand, is driven by his holiness and justice. It is his response to our sin. It can seem out of proportion to the sin from our perspective because we don't understand the seriousness of sin or its consequences. But God is consistent and fair in his wrath against sin. This wrath is unleashed against the ungodliness and wickedness of mankind. Now, usually we think of wrath as something that God will pour out someday in the future at the end of human history, but this seems to indicate it is being poured out now. Godlessness is a disregard of God. It is a vertical problem between us and God. When we deny or disregard God, we then have problems between ourselves and other people. We have a horizontal problem. As a result of disregarding God, we act in wicked ways toward other people, in anger, in violence, in unkindness, and evil. The end of verse 18 says that people suppress the truth. Not that they don't know the truth, but that they suppress it. Verse 19 says that there are things about God that we can know, and we do know. We know these things about God because of what he has created, what we can see in the world around us. He is revealed in what he has made. The beauty and intricacy and complexity of all the universe show us the power and the intelligence and the beauty and the creativity of God and the intelligence of the Creator who lives outside of time, space, and matter. And this is called general revelation. It's the revelation of God that anyone can see. What we can learn about God through creation would not, however, likely bring us to salvation. It's not complete enough. We cannot learn about Jesus, about the cross or the church or heaven, but what we learn about God through what he has made opens us up to more of God, to his word, and to the gospel. On the other hand, if we suppress the truth that we can see, then we take a step towards his wrath. Verse 20 tells us that if we suppress this truth, we are without excuse. We have no excuse for not realizing God exists and knowing some basic things about him. And therefore, we have no excuse for rejecting the more that he gives us and ending up rejecting Jesus. Now, I'm going to read verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor give thanks to him, for their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Failing to glorify God is a sin of the mind. We fail to think of him as we should. We fail to give him the place he deserves. It is also a sin of the heart, for the person does not have gratitude towards God. The result is futile thinking and darkened hearts. Verse 22 says that these people think they are wise, but they are actually fools. Now, the word fool doesn't just mean simple-minded or silly. In the Bible, it has a moral component. It means this person refuses to think rightly. There is an active wickedness involved. These people are not thinking right, and they exchange the glory of God for creative things, such as animals, people, the sun, and other things that they can worship. Anything in the created world can be worshipped. We can worship fame, money, our bodies, our kids, another person, lust, sex, greed, you name it. There are all kinds of things. Trees, animals, the sun. People foolishly and wickedly think these things are suitable substitutes for God. The reality is that all people fall into this category. All human beings in our sin do this. We all fail to think rightly about God, and we put substitutes in his place. Often ourselves in Western culture, we tend to think we are the center of the universe, and we should come first in everything. The wrong thinking earns his wrath, as we saw, and so the point of this is that because all people suppress the truth, all deserve the just wrath of God. Now, the rest of the chapter shows us the gradual darkening minds of those who reject the truth and how God pours out his wrath here and now, not just in a future day. So we saw how people suppress the truth God gives them through creation. Now in verse 24, we see the results of that. God gives them over to their sinful desires, to the results of their own godlessness. Sin carries its own judgment with it. There are consequences of sin and results that appear inevitably in our lives as a result of the wickedness we voluntarily practice. What does it mean that God gives us over? One person said it is as if God let go of a boat that he has been holding onto and allows the current to carry it away. Another person said that it goes farther, that God confirms the boat to the current. C.S. Lewis said, it's not a question of God sending us to hell. It is that in each of us there is something growing that will be hell if not nipped in the bud. Verse 24 specifically says God gave them over to their sinful desires, to the degrading of their bodies. One of the things that happens when people suppress the truth is they begin to indulge their own desires, and that often involves sexual immorality. This results in behavior that is degrading. And we can all think of sexual behavior that is degrading. Think of those who are selling themselves in the pornography industry, or strippers or prostitutes, or those who are sold as slaves in sex trafficking. In the Bible, God uses the marriage relationship as a picture of his relationship with his people. In the Old Testament, he called Israel his wife, and he, Yahweh, was her husband. He calls spiritual unfaithfulness adultery, and he takes faithfulness seriously. But people who have no concern about faithfulness to God will have no concern about faithfulness in human relationships, and so degrading, immoral relationships will result. In verse 26, God gave them over to shameful lusts, exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones. This is a wider tie between idolatry, common in the ancient world, and sexual sin. Almost all pagan worship of the era included sexual activity. As worship itself, sex was part of the religious activity of almost all the religions, for they were fertility religions. The key word to understanding this is in understanding the words natural and unnatural. Paul is not speaking here of something as natural if you have had a lifelong inclination towards it. Natural refers to that which was the intention of God when he created, what he designed us to do and to be. Unnatural is what is outside of his design and will for us. Our inclinations, even lifelong ones, do not make something right or natural. And it's also important to remember that our inclinations or orientation is not the issue. It is indulging in the activity of it outside of God's intended pattern and use. Sexual behavior in the ancient world was as widely varied and blatant as it is today. In Roman culture, one very common sexual situation was between a man and a boy, usually a boy who was a slave, or sometimes an adult male slave. The master had the right to do anything with his slave that he wished, and the slave had no recourse and no out. And Paul uses something here then as an example that his audience would know about, a common thing in Rome, and alludes to this in verses 26 and 27 as an example of things outside of God's intended pattern for relationships. In other words, it's unnatural. In verse 28, the person goes even further. First, they suppress the truth, then they exchange the truth for a lie. Now they don't even retain the knowledge of God in their minds. There follows a final giving over that God does in this chapter. He gives them over to a depraved mind. Paul describes things a depraved mind produces, and it goes beyond sexual deviance. And this list is not pretty. I'm just going to read starting in the middle of verse 28. So that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do these things deserve death, they not only continue to do them, but approve of those who practice them. Now that is a terrible list of vile and depraved behavior. And it's much as we hate the list and all the parts on it, if we are honest, each of us has some of these behaviors in some way active in our lives. See, just because we have not indulged ourselves in sexual behavior that God does not approve does not mean we are free of his wrath. There is a wide scope of behaviors that put us under his wrath. We are all depraved due to sin. The first four descriptions are those who have been given over to a depraved mind, wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Those are pretty general. Certainly all of us can relate to greed in some way or another. This is an insatiable desire for more of what we do not have, often at the expense of others. The next five have to do with envy and its consequences. And this list is envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. This section of the list shows us that living a life of sinful indulgence does not lead to a happy band of brothers or sisters. It leads to discord and damaged relationships. Malice, for example, is putting the worst possible twist on the words or the behavior of someone else. It's ill-natured, intentional meanness. This is what sin produces in a depraved mind. The final 12 are character traits of the unregenerate person. Slanderers are backbiters. Insolence is a mixture of cruelty and pride. The arrogant elevate themselves above others. These people loathe God and ignore him. They are senseless. They are promise breakers. They don't have natural affection, meaning that they don't even act in love toward their own parents or their own siblings or their own children. You would have a hard time finding a more depressing list of character traits. Now, not every person has all of these or even most of these to the full extent, but this is the bent, the inclination of all of those who have suppressed the truth about God, exchanging the truth for a lie, and have not retained the knowledge of God. They have depraved minds. How would you like to be known for one of these? They contribute to a whole host of problems in society, from wars to incest to genocide, through power-hungry and violent dictators to such things as marital infidelity and conflicts in the workforce. This list shows us the results of sin, some of the consequences that are contained in sin itself, and it's pretty ugly. If you have young children, this passage gives you some help in teaching your children. Now, of course, you want to teach them good behavior. You want them to know the difference between right and wrong. But the main problem we have is in our hearts and minds. So focus your parenting efforts on teaching your children to think rightly about God. Check your own right thinking about God. Teach your children to have gratitude toward God. It is getting this wrong that begins the slide that leads to this horrible list of character traits we just read. Now, of course, thinking rightly is not necessarily enough. We have to have a relationship with Jesus in the end to deal with our sin, but thinking rightly about God will keep your child open to his word and to his call. But thinking wrongly about him will harden you toward God and open you up into a slide down into this list of depraved sins. Verse 32 is the final description of a person who has gone down this road in rejecting Jesus. And I'm going to read verse 32 again. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do these things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. They not only know that their sin earns them God's judgment, but they continue to do them. And they take pleasure in others who do them as well. Another way to say this is they call good evil and evil good. They rejoice and celebrate things God calls evil. They take pride in those things. Have you seen anything like this in our world? Well, of course you have. Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to them." A woe is a hard judgment, one that brings trouble and sorrow. There is a cost for calling good what God calls evil. Because of God's wrath, people reap the results of what they have wrongly chosen to love and to revere. And there are two main truths we should get from this passage. When we turn away from God, when we sin, the characteristics of sin grow in us. These things are visible to some extent in every one of us. And the second thing is that this sin brings wrath, both God's outpoured wrath, but also the results that come from the sin itself, the damage it creates in our lives when we indulge in it. God is beginning this book with bad news. He is showing us why salvation needs to be offered. Without God's help, this is the deteriorating reality of humanity. Even as believers, wrong thinking about God can lead us to indulgences in sin. Sin has a draw for us. If it didn't draw us, if we didn't enjoy aspects of it, we wouldn't find it so hard to resist. God does not overlook the sin of his own children either, and sin carries its own consequences. Where are you indulging in wrong thinking about God? Maybe you're thinking your little indulgence is not a big deal. I have done that at times, sometimes still do. Maybe you think that watching something but not doing it isn't a problem. Maybe you think your particular sin is just not that big, but it all has consequences. That Learjet went down because one switch was not properly set. It could have been reset correctly at any time in the flight and the plane would have been saved. But instead, that one little wrong setting resulted in the minds of those on board being confused and slow. They lost consciousness, and the plane flew on until it ran out of fuel, crashed, and disintegrated, killing everyone on board. It doesn't take much wrong to have terrific, horrible results. How are you keeping your thinking right about God today? How are you teaching others in your life to have gratitude towards God in their hearts and to know the truth and to keep the truth about God forefront in their minds? Right thinking about God is our best defense against sin.